Above anything else that I've heard about Makoto Shinkai's newest film Suzume, the most recurring praise that this movie's been confettied in are people claiming that this film was somehow different. For the last 2 decades now, Shinkai's kinda had a reputation for making what most people would consider the same movie, mainly revolving around the romance of 2 star-crossed lovers, literally, and their never-ending struggle to be down to hug. Then he accidentally took the whole world by storm with his runaway success Your Name, and took his world by storm with Your Name's spiritual successor, Tenki no Ko. If anything, this finally gave Shinkai his big break to write a real McDonald's into his script. And as you'd expect from a whole new wave and generation of innocent fans clawing at his throat for more, Weathering with You left theatergoers around the world clutching their popcorn in horror after realizing that this film wasn't actually all too different from its predecessor. In that sense, when Suzume released, a lot of people applauded this film for quote-unquote straying away from past Shinkai tropes. To me, what this movie felt like, though, is if Shinkai saw the overwhelming criticism from new fans that everything he makes is the exact same, trust me, he saw it, and decided to swap around when these recurring plot elements would get introduced into the story in hopes that nobody would realize that this was still basically the same thing. And what honestly doesn't shock me that much is that this strategy worked, even though Shinkai himself has gone on record saying that he's sick of it. Virtually every critic walked away from this film saying it was new and inventive, making me wonder as the loser who stepped foot first into that theater and was also the last person out. Am I a fucking idiot? Seeing Weathering with You in theaters a few years back and falling in absolute love with how good this Big Mac looked, I had pretty high hopes for Suzume, even if the trailer's character designs left me a little apprehensive. I'm just gonna come out and say it, I don't know why people dislike Shinkai so much for sticking within his comfort zone. I mean, to me, Weathering with You is basically just a jacked up Your Name, which was fine by me since I already thought Your Name was a good movie. However, when I'm seeing something that's very clearly trying to break out of its shell, but is patently too afraid to actually remove any of the cliches and instead just tosses them in on the side just in case, and everything just starts turning into kind of a bleh. If I were to give Weathering with You a 9 and Your Name an 8, Suzume would be more like a 6, and while I can respect Shinkai for trying to bake up something sorta new, what this ultimately felt like to me was frosting up the cake before putting it in the oven. From the get-go, this movie confused me quite a bit just by how it looked. It starts out in this dream world flashback where a younger version of the main girl Suzume is walking through this place known as the Ever After that's weirdly reminiscent of his earlier work in stuff like 5 centimeters per second. I don't know if he just got homesick after 15 years or if this was even intentional, but yeah, it's pretty odd. Now I know this is like super subjective, but I've just never been the biggest fan of art that looks like it layered a fuck ton of effects on top of itself to give off the impression that cool things are happening. I'm looking at you, UFO table. Also, why do the flowers look so fucking weird here? I've eaten my fair share of dandelions, but this isn't getting anywhere close to my mouth. I mean, good thing she has a scarf on. It's pretty evident that this dreamy, ethereal aesthetic is what they were going for, so there's not much I can really say aside from that I didn't personally care for it. This boat crashed on top of a house does look pretty sick though. Don't get me wrong, Shinkai has always had a knack for excessive detail, that's what he's known for, but I think his previous 2 movies struck a better balance of conveying what we needed to see without bottlenecking the entire scene with muddled eye candy. Like, I think it's a pretty big red flag when the first thought I had upon seeing the antagonist of this film was wondering why it looked so out of place, and I don't even mean that by how I'm watching a fucking worm crash down over Japan. The red bean bun color palette of this worm that I could really take a bite out of right now has a lot of trouble meshing with the midday cloudless sky, and I just find it extremely weird that the main focal point of this movie still felt half-baked aesthetically. It looks fine in the last 3 seconds before it implodes in on itself, which to me shows that it would have felt a lot more grounded if it was just fully animated in 2D. The CGI looks a little better towards dusk at this middle school in an Ever After land, but really starts showing its lack of polish when contrasted against the harsher skylines of Tokyo. And yeah, I can see the irony in me telling you that I didn't like how this looked while also flashing the trailer's cherry-picked Sakuga on screen, but I'm working with what I've got, okay? This is also Shinkai's first major film to utilize widescreen, which has made editing this video fucking hell. In general, I think when the worm isn't on screen, the backgrounds are pretty good, although I was kind of disappointed that they rarely took advantage of a medium where they could literally play with the lighting however they wanted and instead favored a more realistic, flat look. Even though his other movies also did this, Suzume for some reason looked particularly more normal. Like, the detail is still there, I just think the setting itself is kind of boring. Like, I can still vividly remember the kid in Weathering with You getting off his boat and stumbling his way across a rainy, crowded Tokyo into a McDonald's where he eats one of the best looking burgers that I've ever hoped to lay my tentacles on. Maybe I'm just kind of hungry right now. So yeah, like I was saying, this guided attention to detail that even the smallest scenes had is what made me love Weathering with You as much as I did, even if the plot wasn't especially original. I mean, Shinkai literally slid like 4 references into this one shot, and you expected me to say anything bad here? Like, even if you consider Your Name a better movie than its follow-up, you can't deny that it had a serious lack of McDonald's representation. I mean, what the fuck is a burger shop? Now, you could argue that Suzume did have its own McDonald's promo too, but can you really blame me for still being upset when they barely even included this into the movie itself? Half of this was pre-animated. I learned more about Suzume's mom in this 30-second ad than I did in the film's 2-hour runtime. They really should have focused more on these burgers, but I digress. Makoto Shinkai has never been known for his out-of-this-world character designs, and that's fine. Suzume left me a little confused though, since even from its initial preview, I was caught off guard by how thick everything felt. Even aside from the literal chair, the design of Suzume and the rest of the cast felt weirdly blocky. A part of me thinks the staff just went all in on this cat. Let me make it abundantly clear though that this is still a really good looking movie, and if it came from anybody other than Shinkai, then I wouldn't be nearly as critical of it, but seeing as I know how good his movies can and have looked, this one missed the mark for me by a bit. I'll leave most of the plot somewhat ambiguous so I don't spoil this movie too hard, but for other spoiler-free critics to say Suzume is different from the rest of his catalog is a compliment that I've had trouble understanding. Basically, all I need to know is Suzume has to go around closing doors to stop these worms from causing earthquakes. Altogether, it still retained a lot of the same tropes that his past movies had, which again is fine. I just think the chronology of the narrative was carried out far less seamlessly than honestly any of his other movies to date. All three of these movies each still have an adventurous high school protagonist, main love interest, issue pulling them apart, in this case it's because he's a fucking chair, McDonald, supernatural natural disasters, outgoing side characters that just want to help out because people are good, some type of mistaken authority trying to stop them, feet, probably a dying or dead relative, and rad wimps, except in Suzume they were less rad and more wimp. This movie felt like it was running a 2-hour marathon, biting off more than it could chew, where it'll sometimes bounce plot lines without a second breath, and then immediately trip and fall to a grinding halt in the next. They randomly throw in this melodramatic subplot midway, portraying Suzume to have some sort of residual trauma over her dead mom, when up until this point we've been led to believe that she's long moved on, which she has. The trailers literally don't show this, so I guess just take my word for it, but her aunt goes batshit insane on her about how she never wanted to take care of her and how Suzume ruined her life, to a point where even after it was discovered that her aunt was possessed by some cat, I was caught so off guard that I almost pissed my chair. Because this is Japan, Shinkai put his thoughts a little more politely in one of his recent interviews, saying he wanted to turn this story into a movie about Suzume and another girl journeying, but was pressured by his producer to stick with what already works because audiences are still gonna eat it up, and I think he was right. I mentioned earlier that this film has a habit of switching things around to seem different from its predecessors, and probably the biggest offender of that is the romance, if you can call it that. Like our introduction into this film directly after the prologue is Suzume instantly falling head over heels for this guy. There was never a point where the relationship felt like it wasn't forced. This film isn't bad, but rather just feels remarkably standard compared to how much we've been spoiled in the past, which gave me a bit of a warped perception going into this. Like when Shinkai's mere name is synonymous with my copy-paste key, then it's kinda hard to not compare. It took Shinkai 14 years of refining this formula with his debut OVA to achieve Miyazaki-level notoriety with Your Name, so seeing him at least attempt to try going out of his comfort zone, even though it's against the wishes of his producer, is still an exciting step for him as a filmmaker. Like, even with all the complaints, the sound design here is probably one of, if not his best to date. Like, I've never felt this excited to close a door. I don't hate Shinkai like most pretentious assholes online do, even though I consider most of his pre-Your Name work to be middling at best. I see his movies more as comfort food, so when neither the art nor story live up to my expectations, it leaves me overcompensating by flipping open my phone to watch the Suzume McDonald's ad for the 20th time while walking down to my nearest McDonald's to order another Big Mac, because unfortunately, Shinkai couldn't feed me enough. Thanks for watching. Join me in part 2 on Patreon, where I'll be airing my community college PowerPoint presentation on the severe lack of McDonald's promotion in Suzume. Bye! Thank you to all my patrons, my super mega Ilia fans, Al Carenci, American Nutjob, Arya on the Planets, Arctic Hand, Bruno Bucciolati, Emma, Furl, Limpus, MHub47, Minchi, Mr. Not Specified, Red Raccoon, Sheena, The Epic Droid, Twy, and thank you to all my other patrons. Bye!